So yesterday, we talked a little bit about the lead into the French and Indian War, which is the conflict between Britain and France and both countries' Native American allies for basically control of land in North America. So competition due to the fact that both countries are claiming the same piece of land. There's disputed territory, as we talked about it. And it really boils down to the fact that you have two imperial powers, and that when we talk about imperial powers, we're referencing imperialist nations around the world that are looking to add more land and more territory to their empires. I mean, that's really, in essence, what we're talking about here. We're talking about the fact that we have, countries that are seeking to have control of territory to add to their empires. It's not a situation that is unheard of in American history, because I know last year you talked a little bit about imperialism in Mr. Basinger's class. So it's a similar concept. It's a similar situation here. So what we're going to do is I'm going to show you a very short video clip that kind of talks about the situation involving the conflict in North America, what really becomes of that, and what that leads to. Okay, so let me prompt that real quick. Does anybody have any questions about anything before we proceed? I do want to let you know that I am going back and reviewing. One of the things I mentioned on Monday was that there were some project files that I could not open. That would be the case if you don't have a grade in Skyward. Okay. So if it was marked as incomplete, or if there was no grade posted, it's because I couldn't open the file. All right. I've had a couple of people ask me about their file situation, and in that case, there were some people that were concerned that I couldn't open it, and I did grade it, and that grade's in Skyward. Okay. But there's a few of you that I've started to regrade when you submit it the first time, and I couldn't access it initially. Okay. So. All right, here we go. Hopefully there's no ad. We'll see.
From the very beginning, colonialism in America meant competition. European countries were eager to gobble up as much land as possible in the New World. Sometimes this competition turned into open warfare, and the French and Indian War is a perfect example of this. Here's a crash course of 5 things about the war to get you up to speed. North America was a big, beautiful place full of endless opportunities, and Great Britain and France each wanted a piece of the action. The British controlled their 13 colonies and were looking to expand west. The French occupied Canada and were looking to expand south. It was inevitable that they'd bump into each other, and that's exactly what happened.
Is the video choppy, or is it just me?
The video.
Yeah, it's choppy.
Okay, all right. If we
can hear it fine.
Okay. If you can hear it, then there are some places where I'm going to pause to clarify. So it happens every once in a while when you're trying to stream something and then try to stream it over video. So we'll see how this goes.
The Ohio River Valley, an important trading area with access to the Mississippi River. The French and Indian War marked the debut of 21-year-old George Washington, a lieutenant colonel for the militia in the British colony of Virginia. In 1754, he was ordered to protect a British fort near what is now Pittsburgh. On the way, Washington encountered a French military unit, and the two sides fought in the first battle of the French and Indian War.
So one of the things that's interesting about Washington is we get this introduction to this individual who, at this point, is really nothing more than a land surveyor from Virginia that happens to be a lieutenant colonel in the Virginia militia. Okay. And he's basically the individual that they send to talk with the French about the fact that the French need to vacate this area that they were claiming. So if we if we were talking about this territory, actually you can't see that yet, so let me fix that. Sorry. Okay. So as I showed you yesterday, when we're talking about this disputed territory right here, which is the area that was mainly highlighted from the video clip, this is the area that France and Britain are both claiming because you want to have access to the Ohio River because it takes you all the way to the Mississippi, and then you can take the Mississippi down to New Orleans, and that's an important city for trade. Okay? The fact that both these countries are unwilling to budge is not surprising because both of these are competing European powers that are trying to one-up each other. So Washington is sent to Western Pennsylvania, which is basically at the beginning of where the Ohio River starts, okay? And he is asking the French to leave, and then what happens is essentially he comes back with reinforcements, and there's bloodshed that goes on. And essentially the bloodshed, which gets back to France and Britain, leads to both countries proclaiming war on each other, and thus begins the conflict in North America. It is important to note, though, that there was conflict going on in Europe and the Caribbean and Asia. So it was not just focused only, it was not just limited to what's happening in North America. So this the fighting in North America is just one small part of what's going on. All right. Let me see if I can try this video again, see if that works better now.
The Battle of Jumonville Glen. Washington was young, but he was quickly gaining the experience he would need to eventually command the Continental Army. Years of territorial scuffles turned into full-blown declarations.
Yeah, this isn't working for me. And it's not really going to help you at all if you're just seeing choppy video. So we'll segue. I got a backup plan. So I'll be quiet. Be quiet. There we go. All right, I always got a backup plan. So one of the things that's important about this conflict is the fact that this is really a consequential war. And what I mean by that is that we don't focus primarily on the causes of the war. We don't focus primarily on what happens during the war, besides guys like George Washington and maybe General Edward Braddock. There's not a whole lot of names that you need to know during the French and Indian War. It's more about when the war ends, that end result and what that leads to is tremendous strain between the colonies and Britain. Okay, so the American colonies and the British government or the English government began to kind of have a strained relationship because of what the end result is. Okay, all right, let's go back to the course page. And what I want you to do is there's a link there that says French and Indian War background reading PDF. And I want you to put that into Notability, please. And if Notability is not working for whatever reason, just have the reading out in front of you. That would be ideal. Okay, so what this is a reading that goes into good detail about the war itself. It doesn't break down specific battles as much, but it's going to focus on the situation involving the actions that are going to be taken during the war, and in terms of the colonies trying to become this collaborative, united group. That's one thing. And then two, the efforts in which, the fact that Britain has to win this war, and it's a war that is extremely costly, tremendous amount of debt will be brought upon Britain. What that's going to mean for the relationship between Britain and its colonies, all right? There's one thing I want to show you real quick here, and that's this image of Washington in his redcoat uniform, which I find to be so interesting because that's not it. There it is. Sorry. Because if you look at this situation with with Washington. You don't assume Washington as a British soldier, but this is before the Revolution. This is before the arguments or the even discussion of independence, and we have Washington here appearing in a British military uniform, serving for the militia in Virginia. And I just find it so interesting because, again, he will become the Major General of the Continental Army that leads the fight during the War for Independence. And yet we're in a situation where the citizens in the colonies are still loyal to Britain. There's no hint of animosity really between Britain and its colonies. And that really doesn't happen until after the war itself. Okay. So I just find that interesting to look at. So, but again, I'm a history guy, and so I find that all that stuff to be interesting. Okay. Let's look at the reading here. Please have that up in front of you. So I'm going to start here at the top, and we're going to go through this, okay? So please follow along with me. The French and Indian War was the North American conflict that was part of a larger imperial conflict between Great Britain and France, known as the 7 Years' War. The French and Indian War began in 1754 and ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1763. The war provided Great Britain enormous territorial gains in North America, but disputes over subsequent frontier policy and paying the war's expenses led to colonial discontent and ultimately to the American Revolution. And so what that is the fact that Britain's going to gain tremendous amounts of land. They're going to be basically having everything now from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River, which is going to double the size of the country at the time. There's going to be concern because of that about denying settlers the ability to move across the Appalachian Mountains to settle. And then there's the growing concern about the tremendous amount of debt that has been accumulated from the war and the way in which Britain is going to be expecting the colonists to pay their fair share of that in taxes. Okay. And so what this does is it kind of sets off this domino effect of the colonies beginning to resent the country that's controlling them, because partly it really comes down to this. The colonies for so long have been able to kind of run rogue and have so much autonomy and freedom that it leads to them kind of developing this separate identity from being a loyal British subject. I mean, if you're living in the colonies in 1760, chances are you were born in the colonies. You have no knowledge really of what is outside the colonial era. You know you're a loyal British subject, but you sound different. Your dialect is that of people in Britain. And you identify yourself more as being American than you do as being a British subject. And you may never even visit the mother country of Britain during your lifetime. Okay. The French and Indian War resulted from ongoing frontier tensions in North America as both French and British imperial officials and colonists sought to extend each country's sphere of influence in frontier regions. In North America, the war pitted France, French colonists, and their native allies against Great Britain, the Anglo-American colonists, which is referring to those who are living in the colonies and most likely were born in the colonies, and the Iroquois Confederacy, which controlled most of upstate New York and parts of northern Pennsylvania. In 1753, prior to the outbreak of hostilities, Great Britain controlled the 13 colonies up to the Appalachian Mountains, but beyond lay New France, a very large, sparsely settled colony that stretched from Louisiana through the Mississippi Valley and Great Lakes to Canada. So it's an enormous, very isolated area because the number of French settlers in North America pales in comparison to the number of British settlers, okay? The border between French and British possessions was not well defined, and one disputed territory was the upper Ohio River Valley. That's the part I circled on the map. The French had constructed a number of forts in this region in an attempt to strengthen their claim on the territory. British colonial forces led by Lieutenant Colonel George Washington attempted to expel the French in 1754, but were outnumbered and defeated by the French. When news of Washington's failure reached British Prime Minister Thomas Pelham Hollis, Duke of Newcastle, he called for a quick, undeclared retaliatory strike. However, his adversaries in the cabinet outmaneuvered him by making the plans public thus alerting the French government and escalating a distant frontier skirmish into a full-scale war. Okay? It's Edward Braddock who's a key part of this situation for the British. Okay? So we're on page 2 here. The war did not begin well for the British. The British government sent Edward Braddock to the colonies as commander-in-chief of British North American forces, but he alienated potential Indian allies and colonial leaders failed to cooperate with him. So I want to ask you a question here. What does it mean if someone is considered pretentious? Does anybody know? What does it mean if someone's pretentious?
They think they're better than other people?
Yeah. They basically hold themselves to a higher level and a higher amount of esteem or dignity, and they're more dignified, they think, than other people. And that was an example with Braddock and kind of the way he personified himself. And what that means is that when he interacted with leaders from Native American tribes and colonial leaders, he kind of saw them as beneath him. And it's a common stigma, or excuse me, it's a common attitude, I should say, that most British officers had when they came to the Americas. Okay? They did not consider most colonists to be true Englishmen. And because of that, there was kind of like this, attitude of inferiority that these British officers had for the common folk. So Braddock did not do himself any favors by having this attitude of entitlement. Okay? On July 13, 1755, Braddock himself died while on a failed expedition to capture Fort Duquesne in present-day Pittsburgh after being mortally wounded in an ambush. What happened was that the French and their Native American allies basically implemented guerrilla warfare in killing Braddock and his men. So if you think about warfare in Europe, it's largely defined by rows and rows of soldiers in an open battlefield, and they advance row by row and they fire and then they advance another row. It's totally different in North America because it's a much more denser forested, like wilderness. And it's one of the things that Britain does not learn from this war, and what they're not going to learn during the American Revolution is that their fighting tactics don't really work well in North America. The war in North America settled into a stalemate for the next several years. While in Europe, the French scored an important naval victory and captured the British possession of Minorca in the Mediterranean in 1756. However, after 1757, the war began to turn in favor of Great Britain. British forces defeated French forces in India, and in 1759, British armies invaded and conquered Canada. Facing defeat in North America and a tenuous position in Europe, the French government attempted to engage the British in peace negotiations, but British Prime Minister William Pitt, Secretary for Southern Affairs, sought not only the French cession of Canada — cession means they want Canada to be given to them by the French — but also commercial concessions that the French government found unacceptable. After these negotiations failed, Spanish King Charles III offered to come to the aid of his cousin, French King Louis XV, and the representatives signed an alliance known as the Family Compact on August 15, 1761. The terms of the agreement stated that Spain would declare war on Great Britain if the war did not end before May 1st, 1762. Originally intended to pressure the British into a peace agreement, the Family Compact ultimately reinvigorated the French will to continue the war and caused the British government to declare war on Spain on January 4th, 1762, after bitter infighting between King George III's ministers. Now, King George III is going to have one of the longest reigns in British monarchy history. He's going to be serving from the start of the French and Indian War all the way through the War of 1812. So his reign in Britain is going to be for a very long time, and he's the king that all the colonists are really going to come to despise, those who support independence during the American Revolution, because it's his policies that are going to be, what are being expected to be followed in the colonies, okay? Despite facing such a formidable alliance, British naval strength and Spanish ineffectiveness led to British success. British forces seized French Caribbean islands, Spanish Cuba, and the Philippines. Fighting in Europe ended after a failed Spanish invasion of British ally Portugal. By 1763, French and Spanish diplomats began to seek peace. In the resulting Treaty of Paris of 1763, Great Britain secured significant territorial gains, including all of French territory east of the Mississippi River, as well as Spanish Florida, although the treaty returned Cuba to Spain. France was basically given an ultimatum. Either give up New France, which was the territory in North America, or give up your sugarcane islands in the Caribbean. And France decided to keep the sugarcane islands and give up control of New France, okay? Unfortunately for the British, the fruits of victory brought seeds of future trouble with Great Britain's American colonies. The war had been enormously expensive. Britain had borrowed hundreds of millions of pounds, okay? And the British government's attempts to impose taxes on colonists to help cover the expenses resulted in increased colonial resentment of British attempts to expand imperial authority in the colonies. And again, excuse me, this comes down to the fact that the British American colonies had this great sense of autonomy, really in many ways self-government, and Britain had a very hands-off approach. And now they want to double down and have a very much hands-on controlling approach in the colonies, which is far different, which is why the British colonists are unwilling to accept this, okay? British attempts to limit westward expansion by colonists and inadvertent provocation of a major Indian war further angered the British subjects living in the American colonies. These disputes would ultimately spur colonial rebellion that eventually developed into a full-scale war for independence. Now, when the war started, there was going to be attempts made to organize some kind of collective union among the 13 colonies. And that's what the last thing we're going to talk about real quick. And then we're going to talk about this political cartoon. Some of you may have seen this before. The Albany Plan of Union was a plan to place the British North American colonies under a more centralized government, because as of now, these colonies were more or less acting as 13 separate countries. The plan was adopted on July 10, 1754 by representatives from 7 of the British North American colonies, because 7 would represent a majority, okay? Although never carried out, it was the first important plan to conceive of the colonies as a collective whole united under one government. Representatives of the colonial governments adopted the Albany Plan during a large meeting known as the Albany Congress. The British government in London had ordered the colonial governments to meet in 1754, initially because of a breakdown in negotiations between the colony of New York and the Mohawk Nation, part of the Iroquois Confederation. More generally, imperial officials wanted to sign a treaty with the Iroquois that would articulate a clear colonial Indian relations policy for all the colonies to follow. The colonial governments of Maryland, Pennsylvania, New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire all sent commissioners to the Congress. Although the treaty with the Iroquois was the main purpose of the Congress, the delegates also met to discuss intercolonial cooperation on other matters. With the French and Indian War looming, the need for cooperation was urgent, especially for colonies likely to come under attack or invasion. Prior to the Albany Congress, a number of intellectuals and government officials had formulated and published several tentative plans for centralizing the colonial governments of North America. Imperial officials saw the advantages of bringing the colonies under closer authority and supervision, while colonists saw the need to organize and defend common interests. One figure of emerging prominence among this group was Pennsylvanian Benjamin Franklin. Earlier, Franklin had written to friends and colleagues proposing a plan of voluntary union for the colonies. Upon hearing of the Albany Congress, his newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette, published the political cartoon Join or Die, which illustrated the importance of union by comparing the colonies to pieces of a snake's body. The Pennsylvania government appointed Franklin as a commissioner to the Congress, and on his way, Franklin wrote to several New York commissioners outlining short hints toward a scheme for uniting the northern colonies by means of an act of the British Parliament. And so what I want to do is I want to give you a closer version of this, a shorter version or a closer version of this political cartoon, because it's really one of the first examples that we see of a political cartoon being used. So this is the famous Join or Die. You've probably seen something like this. It was also used during the American Revolution. And it represents the idea of unity among the colonies. Now, if you look here, you'll notice that not all the colonies are represented. We have South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, and New England. The reason why Delaware and Georgia were not included is that they were against the idea of the Union in general, and therefore any kind of plan that was going to happen possibly at this Albany Union would not include Delaware or Georgia because they would not send representatives to support it. Okay, but it's a very effective way of describing the reason why the colonies are stronger united together as one rather than separated, because obviously if you cut a snake up in pieces like that, it doesn't survive. And again, you're going to see a similar usage of this during the American Revolution to encourage the colonies to join together for the sake of the movement for independence. Okay, so I always find that interesting to show. All right. So there is a little bit left of the reading that I'm going to have you finish on your own, but I want to go over today's exit ticket so that we have a clear understanding of what we have to do here. So if you can go ahead and pull that back up for today and before we adjourn here. So if you click on the exit ticket, there are 3 questions that you're going to answer based on the reading, and you are going to need to read all the rest of page 3 and 4 to be able to do this. So number 1 is going to ask you, how could the lack of a definitive border or boundary between France's land claims and Britain's land claims in North America be considered a cause of conflict between the 2 nations? Number 2, how did the British victory ultimately lead to problems between Britain and their American colonies? And number 3, notice it does have 2 parts here, so make sure you see that. Why would it be important for the colonies to be seen as a united union? Why was the plan ultimately not popular among the colonies? And so that's what I want you to complete for today for your exit ticket to help verify attendance, okay? Does anybody have any questions about anything before we depart? If there are no questions, then I will see you tomorrow at the same time. Make sure you get the exit ticket done, and we're going to kind of talk about the themes of the end of the war and what that represents transitioning to the American Revolution, okay? So I hope you have a great day, and I'll talk to you tomorrow. If you have any questions, just send me a message.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
You are welcome.